Mr. Sneddon, go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen, the scene for most of the events that occur in this particular case is going to be the defendant's home, Neverland Valley Ranch. And I think you'll get a very good feel for the ranch through videos that are going to be shown probably by both sides, as well as snippets of tape and footage that is shown in the Martin Bashir documentary. But for just a moment, since probably most or none of you have an idea of what the ranch is like, I want to take you on a little visual tour of what it is. And I want to say, first and foremost, that the ranch is something that is a beautiful thing. And it's been used for beautiful causes. For the children, the underprivileged children, for the children who have been suffering, who have been brought there to share a day or a weekend on the ranch. It's something very good. But just like so many things in life, something very good can end up being, on another occasion, in another setting, something very bad. And several of the witnesses in this case are going to tell you that some of the young visitors at the ranch, that stay on and that visit with Mr. Jackson, and who are there on a prolonged basis, begin to change because of the personality of the ranch. That it creates a no rules, no restriction, no wants environment. And people who walk in there with manners walk out and can be described by some of the staff as hellions, rude, obnoxious. And what is there about Neverland that can do that to somebody? What is there about Neverland Valley Ranch? Well, first of all, for those of you who may not know where it is, I'll try to describe it to you briefly. It's at the foot of the Los Padres National Forest. It's about 2,800 acres. And it's about 4.5 miles from Los Olivos, or, better put, Maddie's Tavern, up Figueroa Mountain Road. It has a zoo with lots of animals. And you heard Mr. Mesereau talk about some of those animals during the questioning of some of you folks. It has an amusement park with a Ferris wheel and a merry-go-round and a lot of other rides for the enjoyment of children and adults. It has a NASCAR-type racing track with small miniature NASCAR cars that people, even adults, can drive around the track. And it has a theater complex with a huge screen and a stage, where people can go to watch movies at any time of the day or night, with a snack bar with free popcorn, free ice cream, and free candy of just about any variety or sort that you may desire. Neverland Valley Ranch, where selected guests are allowed to drive electric-powered golf carts out around the ranch's many acres into the back country on roads, paths, many times unsupervised. Complete with a 2-story video arcade. Video arcade with just about every imaginable video game that you can think of, from the old traditional type to the most recent virtual reality type of video games. 2 stories high, packed with these things. The arcade also has a cellar. The cellar is hidden behind a jukebox. Behind the jukebox, you remove it, go down into the cellar. And in the cellar, wine and alcohol. And it's a place where special guests of Mr. Jackson are taken and they're invited into the cellar and they're treated to alcoholic beverages poured by Mr. Jackson himself. Neverland Valley Ranch, where music is piped throughout the entire main residence area. The lawns are sprinkled with statues and figurines of kids and animals. An area that has a Disneyland-like replica train station, and a Disneyland-like replica train that takes people throughout the grounds, to the zoo, and to the amusement park, and the theater, and back to the main house residence. The residence is complete with 4 guest cottages that are nestled down by 2 lakes that form a boundary to the house. Neverland Valley Ranch, where the main residence has at least 2 rooms on the 2nd floor totally dedicated to every imaginable toy that a child would ever want. Electric trains, games, figures. Lifelike figurines of R2-D2, Darth Vader, Superman, Batman, Daffy Duck. You name it. 1 whole room devoted to dolls and dollhouses in the main residence. Next to the arcade and on the back side of the house is a swimming pool and a jacuzzi. And on the other side is another part of the lake, a teepee, trees to climb, tree houses. You name it. It has everything. Next to the main residence is another building that's attached to it by an arch. And in that arch, in that building, is a security office on one end. And at the other end is a personal office of the defendant, Michael Jackson. In that office is a small museum with figurines, a lot of lifelike figures in the back office, and 6 large-sized plasma TVs. It's in this room that during the course of the execution of the search warrant on November 18, 2003, that at least 2 sexually explicit magazines were found, 1 teenage-themed. Neverland Valley Ranch, where the defendant reigns supreme in his own 2-bedroom, 2-floor suite. 1-bedroom, 2-floor suite. The bottom floor of the bedroom. And let me take you on a little tour, if I can, visually. You'll see it through photographs during the course of the trial. And let me see if I can lay the foundation for that now. The bottom floor is entered through. You walk down a hallway. And when you come into the door, you turn to your left, you open up into the main part of the downstairs. And what you will see, what you did see, if you were a visitor there at the time of the Arvizo boys, was a room that is cluttered. It's cluttered with figurines. It's cluttered with boxes. It's cluttered with video games. There's a piano. There's all kinds of things in a very small, relatively small area. And including king and queen chairs and figures, life-sized figures in the chairs and at other locations in the room. There's a piano that plays different tunes and is electric, can be changed to different formats. In this room, when you walk towards the back of it, towards what would be the back side of the room that fronts onto the back part of the house, you move to the right. As you move to the right, you walk into the master bathroom. As you move into the master bathroom, you see, at the far end of the master bathroom, a large jacuzzi tub. It was in this room on November 18 that police officers seized at least 15 sexually explicit magazines and DVDs lining the tub at the time of the execution of the search warrant. It's in this same room. Right next to the tub is a briefcase containing correspondence private to the defendant in this case, Michael Jackson, that 2 more sexually explicit magazines are found. In a drawer just above that are found numerous envelopes containing cards and letters and correspondence from the Arvizo family. Almost all of them are signed or salutated with the phrase, Michael Daddy, or, Michael, and with greetings and with love and admiration for the defendant in this case. It's actually in this room and from some of the materials in this room that for the first time the boys were shown sexually explicit magazines during their visit to Neverland Ranch during February and March of 2003. And let me pause for a second and let me tell you something that you will learn during the testimony and the evidence in this case about the defendant's master suite. There will be maids, like Blanca Francia, Jesus Salas, other people who are responsible for serving the defendant and taking care of his private premises in this house, and that is, that the defendant, Michael Jackson, was pathological about not allowing people in there without his permission. And that entrance could only be secured by those who knew the secret password and that there was an alarm that went off when anybody approached the door, to give him knowledge of people approaching. Neverland Valley Ranch, where the defendant's bedroom is located on the second floor of this master suite. It's a bedroom that can only be accessed by one entrance and exit. Only one. As you walk through the room into another vanity type of bathroom and you turn immediately to the left, there's a stairway. And as you walk up the stairwell to the top of the stairs, there are walls on both sides until you reach about 2/3 of the way up the stairwell. At that point the right side of the wall gives way to a banister and to pedestals that are separated about 18 inches apart. Ladies and gentlemen, it's in this room and on the bed that you see when you reach the landing and you can see through the pedestals, that the defendant, Michael Jackson, on the second occasion, opened up his Samsonite briefcase and displayed to the boys numerous sexually explicit magazines, both adult and teenage-themed. It's in this room and in this bed that the defendant took a mannequin from the corner. I forgot to tell you, when you reach the top of the bed, and you look over to the far right-hand corner, there's a female mannequin. A young, 13, 14, 15-year-old looking mannequin. And it's in this room and on that bed that the defendant, in the presence of these 2 boys, put that mannequin, put it on the bed, and began to simulate an act of sexual intercourse with this mannequin. It's in this room and on that bed where the boys were sitting there watching TV one night, and all of a sudden, the defendant appears from the stairwell, absolutely stark naked, with an erection. And when the boys look at him, and Star will say he was grossed out, that the defendant says, "It's natural. It's okay. Why don't you boys do the same thing?" Their response was to get up from the bed and go downstairs and pretend like they had to go to the bathroom. It's in this room and on that bed that Gavin Arvizo was molested by the defendant in this case. And it's in this room and on that bed that Star Arvizo saw his brother Gavin molested on 2 separate occasions. During the course of the execution of the search warrant in this case, at the foot of the bed was a box. And in that box, Sergeant Roble, from the Santa Barbara Sheriff's Department, found 17 more sexually explicit adult and teenage-themed pornographic, sexually-themed magazines.
Objection.
And
just a moment. Grounds.
You ruled that term not to be used.
Overruled. You may proceed.
Sexually explicit adult magazines and sexually explicit teenage-themed. And by that, teenage-themed, I mean, when you see them, and you will see them, It is clear that if these young ladies are 18 years old, which they're supposed to be, they sure don't look 18 years old. Also found in his books, in this box were 23 60s vintage nudist magazines whose common denominator is naked pictures of children. As you will see from the photographs presented to you and from the testimony and the evidence of witnesses in this case, that in the room, the defendant's bed is in the center of this room. In the center of this room the bed is flanked by 2 nightstands on each side. In the nightstand on the left, which was opened by Detective Zealous serving the service of the search warrant, he observed a photograph of the 3 Arvizo children. Next to the photograph were more sexually explicit adult magazines. The Samsonite briefcase that I described to you that was shown and laden with these materials was found by Detective Bonner downstairs in the master bedroom, sick. Now, these materials, not only the ones from the Samsonite briefcase, but other materials found at other locations in the house, were obviously taken by the sheriff's department. And some of those materials, many of those materials, were sent to their forensic unit, and they were sent to the forensic unit for the purpose of ascertaining whether or not there were any fingerprints that could be identified with participants in this particular lawsuit. So what they did was they attempt to find latent prints. And Sergeant Bob Spinner is going to testify in this case. Sergeant Spinner is actually retired and he was called back to do the work in this particular case. Sergeant Spinner has been a longtime employee of the Sheriff's Department and has testified on numerous occasions throughout the courts in this county as an expert in fingerprint analysis. And he will tell you that the Sheriff's Department was able to recover from the magazines, not only the ones in the Samsonite briefcase, but others, latent prints. And it was the job and the responsibility of Sergeant Spinner to look at those latent prints and to compare them with the known prints of the defendant in this case that was obtained during his arrest and booking back in December of 2002, and the known prints of the Arvizo boys which were taken by the Sheriff's Department in this case. Sergeant Spinner is going to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that he was able to make identifications. He was able to match the prints of the defendant in this case with the latent prints recovered from some of those magazines in that briefcase and some in other locations. He's also going to tell you that he was able to recover the latent prints. He was able to identify the prints of the boys, both Star and Gavin, on some of those magazines. And, in fact, he was able to find at least one magazine where the prints of the defendant and the prints of Gavin are on the same magazine. You will also hear testimony from both Star and from Gavin that at no time since their visit to that ranch have they ever had an opportunity to touch those magazines since they left, and that includes during the time that they testified at the grand jury. Now, moments ago, you heard the judge read to you the charges in this case involving the lewd and lascivious conduct with a child under the age of 14 and an attempt by the defendant to do the same thing, and that these molestations were accomplished during times when the child was fueled by alcohol. You will learn from the testimony of Gavin Arvizo and Star Arvizo that these acts were acts of masturbation and acts of touching of Gavin. The indictment covers the time period from February 20 to March 12. And the location of these crimes is Neverland Valley Ranch. Now, you heard in the little pieces that I read to you other things from that Bashir video that the defendant said. You heard him say that sleeping with young boys is innocent, that it's a beautiful thing, and there's nothing sexual about it. Ladies and gentlemen, again, the differences between his public statement and his private life could not be more different. Through the testimony of Gavin Arvizo and Star Arvizo, you will see the molestations of Gavin. You will see it as the product of use of liberal doses of alcohol on a child with one kidney, the use of sexually explicit materials to whet the young boy's blossoming sexual awareness, and the defendant's conversations encouraging them to masturbate and describing it as normal and natural, and manipulating the trust and the loyalty bond that had been created, and the pacts of silence that you will hear about in the forbidden world and the forbidden conduct. Indeed, Gavin Arvizo will tell you that it wasn't at Neverland, the first time that he was given alcohol by the defendant in this case. The fact of the matter is, that when they were taken to Miami in February, that Gavin Arvizo was given alcohol by the defendant on that occasion. But the truth and the fact is, that when they got back to the ranch on the 7th of February, that continuously when the defendant was there, almost every night that they were there with the defendant, the boys drank alcohol. And the fact of the matter is, they will tell you that on virtually every night in which the defendant is there, from February 17 till March 12 when they left, that they shared a bed with the defendant, Michael Jackson. Let me pause for just a second and talk to you a little bit about Gavin Arvizo's brother, Star. Star is a year younger. He was born on December 9 of 1990. But I think one of the things that will strike you when you see Starr testify in this particular case, and also when you see photographs of Starr depicted of what he looked like when he was 9 years old and what he looked like when he was 12 years old when he visited the ranch in the year 2002 and 2003, that Starr doesn't look anything like the boy in those pictures or the boy who visited the ranch at the time of these particular events. Because what you will see is Starr Arvizo walk in here, who is a 225-pound center on the freshman football team. He's a boy who's grown considerably since these events occurred. He's also a boy that has been active in the Navy Explorer Unit, just like his brother Gavin. Starr Arvizo will describe to you what he saw one night. He was at the movie theater with other guests at the ranch, and his brother and the defendant were nowhere to be seen. And after the movie was over with, as was his custom, he went back to the main residence. And when he got to the residence, he walked down the hallway, he put in the code, he heard the ding go off of the little alarm. He walked back towards the stairwell, pushed on the door was closed. The door was locked. It was latched from the top. He pushed again. The latches gave way. He went into the little bathroom and turned to his left and headed up the stairway. Now, I described to you how those stairways work and I described to you how they open up to the right. And as he walked up those stairwells, when he got to the location where those banisters appear and the pedestals are located, and he turned to his right, he was frozen. And he was frozen by what he saw. And this is what he saw. Lying on the bed directly in front of him was the defendant, Michael Jackson. The defendant was lying on his back. He had on a shirt, underwear, and socks. Lying next to Jackson was his brother Gavin dressed in underwear and a shirt. Gavin was curled up, and Starr thought he was sleeping. He wasn't moving. No motion. What he saw at that particular point in time also was, on the nightstand directly to the right of the bed, which he had seen on numerous other occasions, were empty glasses and bottles of wine and Sky vodka that the three of them had shared on many occasions and were there that night. Jackson on the left, Gavin on the right. What he saw was Jackson's hand. He saw his left hand wrapped into the inside of Jackson's private parts, into his underwear. And he saw Jackson's left hand over the top of his brother and inside his brother's pants. And what he saw was the motion of Jackson's hand inside of his underpants rhythmically moving up and down and his body moving up and down while he masturbated with his hand under the underpants of the motionless Gavin Arvizo. He stared for about 5 or 10 seconds and then he ran off, and he went back into the guest cottages, and he never stayed in those bedrooms again. There was a second occasion where Starr Arvizo encountered the same thing. It was about a couple of days later, to his recollection. Again, this time he thinks it was between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning. And again, the defendant and Gavin were nowhere to be seen. Starr headed back up to the bedroom. And again, going up the stairway, and again when he turned to his right, he saw the defendant. This time things were just a little bit different. Not a lot. This time the defendant was still on the left. Gavin was still on the right. This time they were both laying on their backs. They were dressed in exactly the same way, except this time Gavin had on shorts instead of the underpants. At this time the actions were exactly the same, except that this time the defendant had his hand up underneath the pants of Gavin, and Starr saw him masturbating Gavin at the same time that he was masturbating himself. And again, he ran off. Starr told no one of what he saw. He didn't tell his mother. He didn't tell his brother. And he didn't tell his sister. He told no one. The first person that Starr Arvizo told about what he saw was Dr. Stanley Katz, a psychologist, who an attorney had referred the Arvizo children to see. Now, let me just take a few moments to describe how this all came about. You see, you will learn later on in my remarks here that there was a point in time where the possessions of the Arvizos were taken and put in storage and that, at a location they knew nothing about. And when they eventually were able to get off the ranch, they were trying to get their belongings together. And Jamie Masada, the family friend, again came to the rescue. Jamie Masada said to Janet Arvizo, "Why don't you contact my lawyer, Bill Dickerman? And why don't you ask Bill Dickerman to try to get your property back?" And you're going to see a number of correspondence between Mr. Dickerman and the attorney representing the defendant in this case, Michael Jackson, Mark Garrigus, trying to get their personal property back. You will also see correspondence indicating that one of the things that Mr. Dickerman was interested in doing was Janet Arvizo was angry, but not at the defendant. She was angry at Martin Bashir. She was angry because her boy was shown around the world without her permission. And she wanted something done about it. Now, Dickerman, in turn, was aware of Mr. Feldman. It was Dickerman's idea to refer the family to Feldman. Mr. Feldman was aware from prior litigation of his relationship with the defendant. And it was Mr. Feldman, without any consultation from the family, who made the decision to send these children to Dr. Katz. And it was during the course of these conversations that both Starr and Gavin Arvizo, for the first time, told Dr. Katz what happened at Neverland Valley Ranch, what Starr Arvizo saw the defendant do to his brother, and what Gavin Arvizo experienced and told the doctor the defendant did to him. At no time during this period did Janet Arvizo ever request either lawyer to file any kind of a lawsuit against Michael Jackson or to pursue any litigation against Michael Jackson. Gavin Arvizo will describe to you his sexual experiences with the defendant, Michael Jackson. He will do it here. He will do it in open court. And he will do it with the whole world watching. He will describe to you with vivid particularity the two separate occasions he was molested by the defendant, Michael Jackson. Gavin will describe to you how he was lying on the bed next to Mr. Jackson, how he was lying there in his underwear and a shirt, in much the same way that Starr had described. How Jackson asked him, Gavin Arvizo, whether he masturbated, and Gavin said, "Number." Jackson replied, "It's okay. It's normal. Everybody does it." Jackson then reached over and inserted his hand up underneath Gavin's underpants. And he proceeded to masturbate Gavin for about 10 minutes while he simultaneously masturbated himself. The second occasion was pretty much like the first. The barriers had been knocked down. He again inserted his hand into the private areas of the young boy, masturbated him while he masturbated himself. But one thing happened on this occasion that didn't happen on the first occasion. On this occasion, the defendant, Michael Jackson, reached over and he grabbed Gavin's arm. And he grabbed Gavin's arm and he began to move it down to the area of Jackson's private parts. Gavin Arvizo immediately yanked his arm away, and that was the end of the event. Now, one of the other things that you should know about the incidents that were described by Starr and the incidents that were described by Gavin Arvizo from the witness stand that will be described is that both of those incidents, all of those incidents actually occurred after the rebuttal video at Hamid Mosley's place that I'm going to describe to you. And they occurred after these children had been interviewed by the Department of Social Services and had said that the defendant had never inappropriately touched them. And interestingly enough, they occurred after all of the preparations had been made for this family to be taken to Brazil and isolated from the media. Ladies and gentlemen, count 1 of this indictment does not involve lewd and lascivious acts. Probably some of you are saying that that's a relief. It does, however, involve the defendant, Michael Jackson. It charges him with conspiring with 5 named individuals: Mark Schaffel, Dieter Weisner, Ronald Konitzer, Frank Cassio, who is also known as Tyson, and Vincent Amen, who is also known as Vinnie Black. As the judge read to you, you now know that indictment also includes charges that, of the conspiracy that it was, the objectives of the conspiracy were to extort, to falsely imprison, and to abduct the children. It specifies, as you've heard now, 28 different acts that the conspirators hoped to achieve in that conspiracy. And as you now know and see, the central focus of those acts was to isolate and to control the Arvizo family and to keep them away from the media, and to convince them to participate in a network-planned rebuttal video to be produced by the defendant and his co-conspirators. Who are these co-conspirators and what are their relationships to the defendant in this case? Well, first of all, let's start with Mark Schaffel. The testimony will be produced. There's probably no dispute about this fact, that they were longtime friends, longtime business acquaintances. Records found at Schaffel's house when a search warrant was executed showed that Schaffel was in business with the defendant in a partnership called Neverland Valley Entertainment, and that Mark Schaffel was the president and was paid generously by the defendant for his partnership in that business. That, actually, the defendant had, as part of this partnership, deeded his residuals to a production that Schaffel was listed as the producer on a video called, What More Can I Give? Schaffel's presence in Germany with the defendant during the Bashir documentary filming. You'll see it during the video. You can see him in the background there. Schaffel, in turn, was a partner and business adventurers with Ronald Konitzer and Dieter Weisner. And Konitzer and Weisner both being German nationals, one living in Germany and the other living in Vancouver, British Columbia. Weisner, by the way, is also captured on the video with Schaffel and Jackson during the Bashir filming in Munich, Germany. Now, the Neverland Valley logs that were seized during the course of the execution of the search warrant on November 18 show that during 2002, particularly during the last part of 2002, that Dieter Weisner and Ronald Konitzer and Frank Tyson Cascio were regular visitors at the ranch of Michael Jackson. Documents further show that at the time of the events that are right at the heart and the crux of this particular lawsuit, that the defendant, Michael Jackson, Mark Schaffel, Dieter Weisner and Ronald Konitzer were involved financially and artistically in the production of the video that was going to derail the Bashir video, a video that was going to be aired and was eventually sold to Fox Network to be aired in the United States on February 20. Emails, documents, press releases from the Jackson camp and the Fox network will show that an important ingredient that was put out to the public about this rebuttal film for the 20th for Fox was the participation of the Arvizo family supporting the defendant, Michael Jackson, who was under siege. The Arvizo family participation was very important to the success of this project. Another important step occurred during this time of the crisis created by the Bashir tape, and that was an individual by the name of Anne Gabriel. Anne Gabriel will testify. She's actually going to be one of the first witnesses who testifies in this case. Anne Gabriel runs a business called Gabriel Media and she has a specialty. Her specialty is crisis management. And in crisis management what she does is she helps people, or people who have products, that are having a bad time with the media or the public, and that's her expertise. She was first approached about this by Jackson's lawyer, David LeGrand, in Washington, D.C. even before the video was shown and just before LeGrand left Washington, D.C. to fly down to Miami to be with the defendant in late January, early February, at the time the Bashir tape was about to be shown. As a member of the Jackson team, very short-lived member, I might add, Anne Gabriel will confirm to you the hierarchy and the way that the team operates. She will confirm to you that Dieter Weisner and Ronald Konitzer and Mark Schaffel were at the top and that they were in charge of public relations. That there was another firm in England called Belliard, which was the equivalent of what she did. Belliard was the crisis management team from Great Britain dealing with the outfalls of the Bashir video over there. And she will confirm to you of being part of conversations, conference calls, decisions involving how to handle the furor created by the Bashir tape. Not only that, ladies and gentlemen, we will produce witnesses in this case that will tell you that the defendant was intimately involved in the day-to-day discussions and decisions and planning of the response to the Bashir video. Rudy Provencio was working for Mark Schaffel during this period of time. And Rudy Provencio will tell you that he was present during conversations, present when he overheard conversations involving the defendant and Mark Schaffel over all of the things that I just talked to you about. There's also no disputing the relationship between the defendant in this case and Vinnie Cascio Tyson. Actually, Vinnie, not Vinnie, Frank, was seen back in the 1990s, early 1990s, on film clippage traveling with Michael Jackson in Europe. Later, he went to work for MJJ Productions, which is the headquarters for the defendant's master, overhead headquarters, handles his business projects, at a very, very generous monthly salary. Now, on the other hand, Vinnie Amen's only connection with these people was that he was a friend of Frank Tyson's. And Vinnie came to California with Frank Tyson. And they came there in February, and he was hired by Schaffel and he was placed in an office right next to Schaffel helping with this crisis management project. The decision for the defendant to participate with Martin Bashir on a video documentary, as you will learn during the testimony and the evidence, was well thought out. It was part of a comeback that he was trying to make. And in the course of agreeing to do that, there were 4 segments that were filmed. It was an 8-month project. Segment filmed in Munich, Germany. There was a segment filmed in Las Vegas, Nevada. There was a segment filmed, the last segment in Miami, Florida. And there was a segment filmed at Neverland Valley Ranch in the fall of 2002. Now, the defendant had, at this point in time, in the fall of 2002, had little or no contact with the Arvizo family for a long period of time. Even though the kids had visited the ranch with Chris Tucker during the summer, the defendant wasn't there. So it's rather strange, but understandable, why, in the fall of 2002, the defendant, Michael Jackson, arranges to have a call made inviting the Arvizo children to come to Neverland Valley Ranch. And the plan is for Jackson to use cancer survivor Gavin Arvizo as part of his comeback attempt in the Bashir video, and to enlist him in an interview to take place on the ranch. Understandably, the children were eager to renew their friendship and acquaintanceship with the defendant in this case and agreed. The mother was not invited, nor did she insist that she come, and no releases for these children were obtained by either Martin Bashir or the defendant. A limousine picked the children up at the apartment, brought them to the ranch. As soon as they arrived at the ranch, Gavin was taken aside from the other 2 children by the defendant, and he was taken into a small room and the door was closed, and he will tell you they were there for about 5 to 10 minutes. Gavin will tell you what went on inside that room during that 5 or 10 minutes. And what he will tell you was that the defendant told him this was like an audition. The defendant already knew that Gavin wanted to be an entertainer. He said it was like an audition. He didn't tell him it was going on international TV, it was an audition, and he told him what to say and he told him what not to say. And after the rehearsal was done, they came out. Gavin, for his part, was then placed on a couch next to the defendant. And during the course of the interview that occurred, that you will see in this courtroom, that's part of the reason that the Bashir video backfired on the defendant in this case. For in part of that video, you will see Gavin Arvizo holding hands with the defendant, Gavin Arvizo affectionately putting his head on the defendant's shoulder. And the reaction, not only to people who saw it, but the reaction from Bashir, was instantaneous. And you can see by the questions he begins to ask Jackson about his relationship not only with Gavin Arvizo but with other children, led to the questions that I read to you and to the defendant's answers in the follow-up interview in Miami, Florida. Now, what happened was that after the filming, defendant left the ranch immediately. The children stayed around that night and then were taken home early the next morning. Between the time of the filming of that video and the time of the Martin Bashir video, there was no contact between the defendant and the family. Not a single phone call. Mark Schaffel, through his contacts in the media, had received an advanced copy of the transcript of the Bashir documentary. And he immediately contacted Ronald Konitzer. And they immediately contacted Michael Jackson. And it was apparent to anybody who saw it that even though the video starts out in a very favorable way to the defendant, that the totality of the video was clearly not what the defendant anticipated, what he expected, but it was clearly a boomerang on a comeback attempt, and they saw it as a public relations disaster. The entire video was broadcast in England for the first time on February 3, 2003 to 17 million people in Europe on a show called Trevor McDonald. As I said, Bashir was less than complimentary, and he expressed open disbelief and concern about Jackson's admissions and his behavior with children, both his and others. So there will be no argument about the fact that somehow Bashir had tricked the defendant into going into this topic or somehow misled him down a path. The defendant reiterated pretty much the same statements about sleeping with young boys in a follow-up conversation with Ed Bradley on 60 Minutes, 2 weeks later. Through the testimony of insider Ann Gabriel, Rudy Provencio, Ian Drew, as well as documents, computer printouts seized at Mark Schaffel's residence, you will learn how Jackson and Jackson's own employees and the co-conspirators all felt that the Bashir documentary was like a moving landslide. And if it wasn't stopped, it was going to destroy everything in its path, including Michael Jackson. Documents weekly show that the group went into a damage control environment mentality. There are other parts of the Bashir tape that I haven't mentioned that you will see. And I'm not going to go into them in great detail, but also were of concern of the people involved in the crisis management of the situation for the defendant. There were parts about scenes that were taken at the Munich Zoo with the trip with the kids. There were scenes involving incidents that occurred at a hotel. There were things that occurred in Las Vegas during a spending spree and again the outfootage and takes during the Gavin Arvizo interview. The enormity of the furor, just to give you an idea of just how big it was, looked at from the side of Michael Jackson, is that Ann Gabriel, who was hired, was asked to give an opinion on a scale of 1 to 10 how bad things were for Michael Jackson. She said it was a 25. A 25. Christian Robinson, a writer who was hired by the Jacksons' co-conspirators to do commercials and documentaries, and who actually did the interview of the Arvizo family on the 19th and 20th of February, described the "living with Michael Jackson" as a nightmare for Jackson. For the Arvizo family, they had no idea. They didn't receive an advanced copy of the transcript. They were not able to see the documentary when it was shown in England. And the way they found out that their children were shown on this documentary was BBC reporters started coming around the house and pounding on the door, and more media came and then went to the schools asking for interviews. And, of course, the Arvizo family had no idea what was going on. And the worst of it came because Gavin Arvizo and the Arvizo family had never seen the interview. They had never seen the context. They had never seen the Miami interview. And they had never seen the questions and answers with Bashir about sleeping with young boys. But Gavin found out in a very difficult way about how his role played out in this video when classmates and friends came up to him and began calling him faggot, and began calling him rude, crude, sexual remarks about his relationship with the defendant in this case. That's how Gavin Arvizo found out about this video. Further documents from the Schaffel residence and emails that were exchanged between Konitzer and Schaffel and Weisner, and other people involved in this management situation, reveal that the idea was, at this point in time the primary focus was to get the Arvizo family and to get them isolated and sequestered and away from the media in a way they would not make any statements to the media, and hopefully to enlist them, as I said, in this planned pro-Jackson video. When all of this public storm hit, and when Schaffel and Konitzer got the advanced copy of the Bashir tape in late January, the defendant in this case was in Florida. And he was in the Turnberry Inn. It's not an inn, it's a resort. It's a very swanky resort, actually. They'd be very upset if I called it an inn, I guess. He was down there with co-conspirators Dieter Weisner, Ronald Konitzer. And he summoned Frank Cassio from New Jersey, who got down there immediately and was there about the time the Arvizo family arrived. Now, it's February 4, 2003, and the Martin Bashir video has already been shown in England. It's already been seen by an international audience. On February 6, it's going to be rebroadcast in the United States on network TV, on ABC, on 2020. Barbara Walters was the commentator and Bashir was a guest to narrate some of the events of the documentary. Before that documentary was broadcast in the United States on the 6th, Michael Jackson took the initiative. It was Michael Jackson, who, on the 4th of February, who had had no contact with the Arvizo family or children since fall, set forth, actually called his office, MJJ Productions. And there are notations in Evi Tavashi, his business manager's book, showing a request on the part of Jackson to try to locate the Arvizos and get telephone numbers so he can contact them. There are not only the notations in the book, but the television records from the Turnberry Inn and his suite reflect those phone calls being made on the 4th. It also reflects that on the 4th, after that information is obtained, that the defendant twice tried to contact the Arvizos at Janet Arvizo's parents'. She wasn't there. The next morning, again it's the defendant's voice who's heard in this, reasserting himself back into the life of the Arvizos. It's the defendant, as the records at the Turnberry Resort show, made a 27-minute phone call to the Arvizo family that was currently at that particular time in West Los Angeles with Major J. Jackson, who was going to be the future husband of Janet Arvizo. That phone call took place at 6:58 California time, 9:58 in Miami, Florida. It was Jackson who spoke to Janet Arvizo and Gavin Arvizo. And it was Jackson who told them that there were people out there who wanted to kill them, who told them that it was dangerous out there for them, and that Gavin was in danger. It was Jackson who wanted Gavin to join him in Florida. And it was Jackson who told them that he wanted Gavin to participate in a press conference. And it was Jackson who told them that a strong statement supporting him, Michael Jackson, would go a long way to making these killers go away. Janet Arvizo refused. She wasn't going to let her boy fly on a plane all by himself to Miami, Florida. She refused. And there were arguments between Jackson and Janet Arvizo. And it finally was settled. Gavin Arvizo would go to Florida. But he would only go to Florida with his mother and his brother and his sister. Jackson was upset and he was angered, but he had to agree, because he needed Gavin in Florida. Their airline records reflect they were made by MJJ Productions and through the travel agency characteristically and uniformly used by MJJ Productions to make reservations for this family to fly to Miami in the afternoon of the 5th, the very same morning, by the way, that the phone call was made. They were scheduled to leave out of Los Angeles Airport at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The flight never occurred. And the reason it didn't occur was because Chris Tucker, who was also planning a trip to Miami on a chartered jet, it was arranged the children would go with Chris Tucker later that night. And that was, in fact, what happened. So on the night of February 5, the night before the 2020 viewing, this family is on a chartered jet with entertainer Chris Tucker and his family flying to Miami, Florida. And they get there. It's probably after midnight by the time they get there, and they land at the Miami airport, and they're picked up by a limousine and they're taken to the Turnberry Resort. And they were put up in, what would be by any standards, a very, very nice room. But it's late. And after some conversations with Chris Tucker, they all go to bed. Everybody sleeps in until the next morning. But, you see, the plan is working perfectly, because the family is now there, they're now under their control, and they're now isolated from the media and the public. Now for a description for you about what happened in the next couple of days about the control and the attempts to convince the family to participate in the video. Again, it is Michael Jackson's voice that is heard first and foremost in this attempt. On the 6th, when everybody got up, they went upstairs, and Jackson's suite was right above the room occupied by the Arvizo family. And they went into the room. It's a large room. It's the presidential suite. There was plenty of room and plenty of people there. In fact, they were introduced to Ronald Konitzer and Dieter Weisner, who were also in the room. And by that time, Frank Cassio Tyson are also in the room, along with his brother and his sister. It's at this point that the defendant, Michael Jackson, introduces Ronald Konitzer and Dieter Weisner to Janet Arvizo. And it is the defendant, Michael Jackson, who instructs Janet Arvizo to do everything that Ronald and Dieter tell you to do. It is Jackson who concludes by saying to Janet Arvizo, "These are the ones that are going to make the threats go away." It was for that reason, trusting the defendant and trusting what he said, that Janet Arvizo agreed to the request by Weisner and Konitzer to sign 2 blank pieces of paper with her signature, one on the 6th and one on the 7th before they left. Unbeknownst to her, and without her permission, that blank signature on the bottom of that page ended up having a typed part at the top saying that she authorized and joined in Michael Jackson's lawsuit or complaint to the British Standards Commission against Bashir. She had never been consulted on that and had never agreed to have her signature used in that capacity. There was some other significant events that occurred on the day of the 6th and just before the evening of the 2020 broadcast. It's clear from the testimony of a number of different people who will testify in this lawsuit that Michael Jackson was adamant about one thing. He was adamant that no one was going to watch the "Living with Michael Jackson" broadcast that night. They were prohibited. And they didn't. Except that at one point in time, Janet Arvizo decided she'd like to see it, and she went down to her room. When they found out that she had left, they sent somebody down to get her, and brought her back up to Jackson's room so she couldn't see the documentary. Another thing happened on the 6th. It was the beginning of the efforts by the people who would make this thing go away, Konitzer and Weisner, to convince Janet to participate in the rebuttal and to say nice things about Jackson. And there's no coincidence that the same people who were involved in these efforts in Miami, you will learn in a few moments, or a few minutes, to be candid, that these are the same people involved in the attempts, once they're at Neverland Ranch, to get the same interview, and the same remarks, and the same support for Michael Jackson. It began in Miami, but they weren't making any progress. Konitzer and Weisner echoed the same words, almost word for word, that Michael Jackson said about there being threats, only this time they expanded the threat not only from Gavin, but to the entire family. One of the other things that happened was during the time that they were in Miami, they released a press release quoting Janet Arvizo attacking Bashir and supporting the defendant. Janet Arvizo will tell you she never was asked about that press release. She never gave authority and knew nothing about it. Ian Drew, another member of this, that was hired by the co-conspirators, who is also involved in production of videos, an interviewer of some note, will tell you that he was contacted while he was in Miami during the time everybody was there on the 6th and 7th. He was contacted by Weisner, and he was contacted by Konitzer and particularly Weisner. And Weisner told him, "Call Mark Schaffel. We want you to be a part of this network broadcast program as one of the interviewers," and that the Arvizo family was to be one of the key parts of it. Ladies and gentlemen, there's another thing that happened in Miami, and this is where the attempts by the co-conspirators to enlist the support of the Arvizo family, to isolate them and to control them, converged with the infatuation of the defendant with Gavin Arvizo. And you will learn that in addition to having Gavin Arvizo come to Miami, Florida, that on the day of the 6th, almost immediately when Gavin was in the presidential suite, that Jackson beckoned him to come back in his room. And he closed the door, and he began to reacquaint himself with Jackson, between Jackson and Gavin, and they were having conversations. And he talked, and he remembered that Gavin wanted to be in entertainment. And he said, "Why don't we pretend like this is an audition? And why don't we do this? Why don't we have a cussing contest, and we'll use cuss words? I'll use a cuss word, you use a cuss word. We'll just go back and forth. You pretend like it's an audition," and he did. Well, the cuss words escalated until they involved very sexually graphic cuss words that I'm sure all of you have heard on a number of occasions, on the playground or the gym, or other places. It was interrupted when one of the nannies walked into the room. It was the first step in desensitizing the boy. It was the first step in introducing him again to the no rules, no restrictions and no wants world of the defendant in Neverland Ranch. In addition to this, it was on this occasion and on this day and in that room that the defendant later took Gavin Arvizo aside and brought him into the room and offered him wine that the defendant was drinking out of a Diet Coke can. Gavin Arvizo will tell you that when he woke up the next morning, he had a stomachache and he had a headache. Doesn't that sound familiar? And his brothers and sisters will tell you on that particular night, on the 6th, that Gavin was acting very weird. He was acting out of character, and he was very talkative. Other things that happened during the next few days to cement this relationship were further furnishing of alcohol to not only Gavin, but to Star. And in the attempt to create this trust bond between the defendant and this child, who already, and had in the past, referred to him as Daddy and Daddy Michael, he gave him presents. He gave him his jacket. He gave him a watch that was purportedly worth $75,000, which it wasn't. And it was cemented through other acts of kindness and generosity on his part to the child and to the child's family. On the following day, everybody left Turnberry. So we're now, from the point where the video was shown for the first time on the 3rd, it was shown in America on the 6th, and it's now the morning of the 7th, and we're still at the Turnberry. And there's one final last thing that happened. Chris Tucker had arranged that the ladies, meaning Davelin Arvizo and Janet Arvizo, were taken down to the salon and were able to have a pedicure. And these boys, who were at this time 12 and 13 years old, were taken in and were given a massage. Having pedicured them and massaged them, they were told to pack and that they were leaving and they were taken to the airport. And when they got to the airport, there was one final problem. Janet Arvizo was told she was not to be on the chartered jet taking the family back to California. She was to take a flight the next day. I don't think it takes a whole lot of imagination to figure what your reaction would be to that, or what her reaction to that was. It ain't going to happen. And it didn't happen. So eventually one of the bodyguards had to get off the charter flight. Janet Arvizo was on it, and the flight left Miami. Now, the flight itself was highlighted by a number of events. It was highlighted by the fact that there was more drinking. The stewardesses will tell you unequivocally, without hesitation and without contradiction, that on that flight with these boys, that she served alcohol in those cans full of wine. And the boys drank, especially Gavin. They will also tell you it was during this time that the defendant, as both the brother and the sister will tell you, would lean over and whisper in Gavin's ear, and Gavin would lean over and whisper in the defendant's ear, like a conspiracy. And that at one point in time after the leaning over and the whispering in each ear, the defendant gave him the jacket. And on another occasion, he gave him the watch. And Gavin will tell you what all that was about was the defendant swearing him to secrecy not to tell anybody about the wine. The presents were, in effect, a bribe for that secrecy. They'll tell you at least 2 other incidents during the time of the call, during the time of this flight back to Neverland. And by the way, I didn't say it, but I should tell you who else was on that plane. There were 2 other children, the brother and sister of Frank Tyson Cascio. There were nannies. There were Michael Jackson's children. And there was a physician by the name of Al Farskian who was also on that flight. During the flight, after the kids had consumed the alcoholic beverages, the defendant and Gavin began to make crank calls using the plane's telephone system. They would call people, just at random numbers, and make various crass and crude remarks and then hang up. That happened. On another occasion during the flight, after Gavin had gone to sleep and put his head on Jackson's shoulder, both the mother and the brother observed Jackson to be caressing the face of Gavin Arvizo with his hands and to reach over and to lick his forehead with his tongue. They will tell you that they thought that at that point in time Jackson was also intoxicated. The plane landed in Santa Barbara. Michael Jackson's chartered plane landed in Santa Barbara. It didn't take the family back to their home. A limousine was there, and the limousine took them to Michael Jackson's secluded and isolated ranch, not back to the apartment on Soto Street. There was never a press conference held in Miami. None. 0. Once at Neverland Ranch, the experiences of the mother and the daughter and the 2 Arvizo boys were quite different. And they couldn't be more contrasting. For the boys, there was no school. There was no homework. They had free rein at Neverland. The arcade, the cars, the amusement park, the theater, the toys. They, in effect, had the undivided attention of Michael Jackson. They slept in his bed. They enjoyed his wine, enjoyed his magazines that I've described previously, and they dominated his attention. And I don't think it takes a whole lot of imagination for you, or for anybody else in this world, To imagine that for young 12 and 13-year-old boys, it just doesn't get much better than that. Meanwhile, Janet Arvizo and Davylin Arvizo, their experiences were quite different. Now, let me pause for just a second and just give you a quick bio about Davylin Arvizo. Davylin is the older sister of these two boys, and the first child of Janet Arvizo. Davylin, at the time of these events, was approximately 14 or 15 years old, and she was a high school student at Monte Vista High School in El Monte. Now, Davylin now will tell you that she has graduated from high school. And that also at the time of these events back in the summer when some of the events were going on, that she was a member of the Los Angeles Police Department Academy, because she wants to be a forensic scientist, crime scene investigator, and that she's taking classes in that regard right now at City College and maintaining a full-time job. Davylin and Janet Arvizo were placed in the guest cottages that I described to you. Janet will tell you, Janet Arvizo, that she rarely, if ever, left the guest cottage. That will be confirmed not only by her children, but by the ranch employees. Janet became a recluse. She didn't leave the cottage on hardly any occasion. Davylin, for her part, rarely saw the boys. They were off with Jackson, and it was a boys' thing and girls weren't invited. And they made it very clear that she wasn't to be invited. On the one occasion that she was brought into, she was able to follow the boys into Jackson's bedroom. She'll describe to you that incident and how eventually she had to leave, because it became very uncomfortable and very obvious that they did not want her around. She was a girl. She'll tell you how this family that was so close and had bonded so much together because of the adversity that they had felt and experienced through so many things with their family, with their father, with the divorce, with the sex, with the physical abuse of the father that was on both the children and on the mother that they witnessed and experienced. They were a close family. And she could see the boys being pulled apart and that she was no longer a part of their world. At the same time now this family is at Neverland. This is the 7th, the 8th, the 9th, the 10th, the 11th and the 12th of February. At the same time, the co-conspirators begin to travel to California, they begin to travel to Los Angeles, and they begin to travel to Neverland Ranch. The first to arrive is Dieter Wisner. He arrives on the 8th. He flies into LAX from Miami and he immediately goes to the ranch. And the ranch logs confirm that he's on the ranch, and he's there for days. On the 10th, Ronald Konitzer from Vancouver, and Frank Tyson and Vinnie Amen arrive almost within like 3 or 4 minutes. Konitzer goes to the ranch. Tyson and Vinnie originally go to Schaffel's place. Vinnie Amen is put to work. He's hired. He's on the payroll for the conspirators. Meanwhile, some other things are happening. And what's happening is we're now at the point in time, ladies and gentlemen, where the 2020 program has occurred. We're now at the program where the Jackson team is planning the network production that was sold eventually to Fox TV for $3 million to be aired on the 20th. Now, between that period and the 20th of February, the crisis continues to get worse, not better. And not because of Bashir or the documentary. What happens is kind of the things that Mr. Mesereau talked about in his statements to you during voir dire. The media sees the hot topic. CBS, not to be outdone by ABC, has an Ed Bradley program and an interview with the defendant. NBC, not to be outdone by either one of them, has a program called Dateline, which is another very, very, very bad piece about the defendant. At the same time as that's going on during this 2-week period, a website called SmokingGun.com decides to publish documents involving some litigation involving the defendant.
Objection.
Sustained.
I'm sorry.
Sustained.
It's about this time that Anne Gabriel is added to the team, and about this time she begins to participate in conference calls with Schaffel, Konitzer, Mark Garrigus, David LeGrand, and other people associated with the events that occurred here. The other thing that was found during the course of the search warrant at Mark Schaffel's residence is the fact that I spoke to you about the Fox film that was going to be shown on the 20th. There are clearly documents which reflect the fact that the defendant in this case, Michael Jackson, was in partners with Mark Schaffel, Dieter Wisner, Ronald Konitzer in this production and the distribution of the shares of the monies from that production. There's another thing that the testimony and the evidence is going to show in this case that was different between the experiences of the boys, who were spending their time with Michael Jackson, and Janet Arvizo. During this time period, from the 7th of February till the 12th of February, Ronald Konitzer and Dieter Wisner were trying to convince Janet Arvizo to participate in the promised footage for the February 20th production. We know this not only from emails and records and documents, but we know it from Michael Jackson's own personal videographer, Hamid Maslahi. The fact of the matter is, they attempted to try to encourage her, much as they did in Miami. And then it became quite confrontational. They had scripts that they showed her. They tried to convince her to participate, and she would not. They told her that people went out to the school, that they were in danger, and people were looking for the children at the school. They went out and said that these were the only people who could protect them from these fictitious killers or people who were threatening throughout the community, and that they needed to stay at the ranch to be isolated from that danger. As I said, they were presented with scripts. Now, you don't need, and you will not have to take the word of the Arvizo family that the eventual interview that took place on the 19th and 20th was scripted. You will hear testimony from Christian Robinson that, in fact, he worked on the script with Schaffel and a lawyer, and that others saw the script and heard the conversations over the telephone, including Rudy Provencio. And Janet was refusing to participate. On one day things came to a crisis and Dieter Weisner asked that Gavin Arvizo give him the watch back. He said they would put it in a safe place, they would keep it for him, and they would give it back to him later. They gave no reason for wanting to get the watch all of a sudden. Gavin refused. And Janet Arvizo refused. And things became so tense that the family was going to attempt to try to leave the ranch. Now, this is probably a very good time to talk a little bit about the person you've heard so much about. And the person that I can tell you probably unequivocally will be on the witness stand in this case up there for a number of days during this trial. It's the mother of Gavin Arvizo and Star Arvizo and Davalin Arvizo, Janet. And let me tell you a little bit about what I think that the testimony and the evidence in this case is going to disclose about Janet Arvizo. She was married at 16. She had 3 children by the time she was 21. She was in a violently abusive, physically abusive relationship with her husband for 16 years. Not only physically abusive to her but to her children when they'd try to come to her defense. I think you will see, through the testimony and the evidence presented here, that she presents as someone who's somewhat insecure, somewhat dependent, easily influenced, and at times can be adamant and quite emotional and determined. Heavily religious, and personally overly affectionate. I think you will see and get a sense of Janet Arvizo from the tape-recorded conversations not only with Frank Tyson, but a later conversation I'll discuss with you in a few moments by a private investigator hired by the Jackson camp, Brad Miller. That she speaks fondly of love and affection, that she desperately wants to be loved and her family to be loved, and to be part of a family that they weren't able to have because of the fact that there was no father in the particular family at this time. That she's taught her children to do something which, to a lot of people, kind of sets them off, and that is that when they greet you, instead of giving you their hand, they like to hug you and say they're glad to meet you. Some people are not used to, on a first occasion or encounter, to that kind of a greeting. But that's the kind of person that Janet Arvizo is, and that's the kind of things that she instills in her family. The testimony and the evidence in this case will show you, like virtually every one of us in our life, that she's made mistakes, that she's done things that were wrong. The testimony will show in this particular case that, in fact, on one occasion during the lawsuit that she lied in a deposition. She was asked whether her husband ever beat her, and she lied. Because she knew at that point in time nobody knew it except for her and the children. And that if she had to admit the truth, she most certainly would get another beating. She lied under oath. It's true also that she obtained welfare funds when she wasn't entitled to them. She's going to tell you that, and she's going to admit that. It's not a large amount of money. But she did it. And it was wrong. And she knows it was wrong. She's not a person, as you will see from the testimony and the evidence in this case, that made necessarily the kinds of decisions that you would have made during the facts or circumstances of this case. But none of us can put ourselves in her place. But we're going to help you. We're going to help you in that respect, by having an expert come in and testify to you to what it's like to be a person. To be in a relationship that's abusive for 16 years, and how that affects their judgment system and the reaction to certain things.
Objection.
Sustained.
Judge, you approved that.
No, I didn't. I haven't ruled on it.
I think one of the things that also will be shown throughout this trial about Janet Arvizo is that on these same tapes that I referred to with Frank Tyson and Vinnie Amen, that she, without hesitation, over and over and over again during the events and the times that these things happened, expressed open admiration for the defendant, open love for the defendant and appreciation for what the defendant had done for the family. That she trusted him. That she loved him in that kind of a respectful way. She never talked about suing Michael Jackson. And she will tell you today on the witness stand here that even though her attitude towards Michael Jackson is no longer loving and no longer respectful, or no longer does she feel him the father figure in her life, that she's bitter about what happened. She will tell you that she wants not one penny from the defendant in this case. She will tell you, "I do not want the devil's money." As I told you, the situation degenerated pretty badly. And on the 12th, Janet Arvizo went up to Jesus Salas and, speaking in Spanish between the two of them, she asked Salas if she could take them, the family, from the ranch. And he said, yes. She had asked to leave before, but was denied by Dieter and Ronald the ability to leave. Jesus grabs a car and takes them down to Los Angeles. It isn't until the following morning that the co-conspirators and Michael Jackson learn that the Arvizo family has fled the ranch. And the second explosion occurs within the Jackson camp. Anne Gabriel will tell you about a conversation early in the morning that she received by an agitated and concerned Mark Schaffel about the fact that he described the Arvizo's flight from the ranch as a disaster. She will later tell you about a second conversation where Schaffel called and was much relieved to say that they had contained the situation. You will soon learn, after we take. I think, Your Honor, we're going to take a break at 11:30, is that correct?
Correct.
After the break, just exactly what it meant to have the situation contained. But let me tell you that the evidence that will be presented in this case through the telephone records that have been subpoenaed and obtained through search warrants will show you that the lines burned off their hooks between the co-conspirators, Michael Jackson, Neverland Ranch, and some of the parties involved in the conspiracy.
All right, we'll take our 11:30 break.